The sun god Re begins his eternal journey across the sky, painting the Nile's waters gold as they flow northward toward the Great Green Sea. Along the riverbank, a young scribe named Amenhotep dips his reed pen into black ink, preparing to record the day's grain deliveries. But this is not just bookkeeping. This is the heartbeat of an empire that has endured for over 2,000 years. You think you know ancient Egypt. The pyramids rising from desert sands, golden pharaohs in their tombs, mysterious hieroglyphs carved in stone. But these monuments, magnificent as they are, tell only part of the story. The real Egypt, the Egypt where 90% of the population lived and died, was found not in the tombs of kings but in the mud brick houses along the Nile, in the workshops where craftsmen shaped eternity from clay and gold, in the fields where farmers coaxed life from the desert's edge. This is the story of how ordinary people lived extraordinary lives in the shadow of the gods, how they built a civilization that would outlast empires, how they created a world where death was not an ending but a transformation, where the divine walked among mortals, where every sunrise was a victory over chaos and every flood a gift from heaven. Welcome to Egypt at the height of its power, during the reign of the boy king Tutankhamun, when the empire stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates, when Egyptian gold bought loyalty from kings and Egyptian grain fed the known world. This is not the Egypt of Hollywood movies or museum displays. This is the Egypt where people were born, lived, loved, worked, and died in the certainty that their lives were part of a cosmic order that had existed since the beginning of time and would continue until the stars fell from the sky. To understand life in ancient Egypt, you must first understand the Nile, not just as a river, but as the source of all existence, the liquid thread that connected the gods to mortals, the north to the south, the living to the dead. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, the black land referring to the rich, dark soil deposited by the annual flood. Everything beyond the river's reach was Deshret, the red land, a hostile desert where only the dead and the gods could survive. The Nile was more than geography. It was theology made manifest. Every year, like clockwork, the river would rise, transforming Egypt from a narrow strip of green into a vast inland sea. The flood brought not just water, but life itself, millions of tons of fertile silt that renewed the soil, fish that filled the nets, and the promise that the gods had not forgotten their people. Amenhotep, our young scribe, lived in Memphis, the great city where Upper and Lower Egypt met, where the narrow river valley opened into the broad delta. From his window in the House of Life, the temple school where scribes learned their craft, could see the entire rhythm of Egyptian civilization laid out before him. To the east, the sun rose over the limestone cliffs where the dead were buried, their tombs carved into the rock to ensure eternal life. To the west, the living city sprawled along the riverbank, mud brick houses with flat roofs where families slept under the stars, workshops where craftsmen created goods for this world and the next, markets where traders from across the known world haggled in a dozen languages. The Nile determined everything: when to plant, when to harvest, when to build, when to celebrate. The Egyptian calendar was based on the river's rhythm: 4 months of flood, Akhet, 4 months of growing, Pere, and 4 months of harvest, Shemu. This wasn't just agriculture. It was a cosmic dance in which every Egyptian played a part. During the flood season, when the fields were underwater, farmers became builders, working on the pharaoh's monuments or repairing temples and dikes. The entire kingdom transformed itself, as if the rising waters had washed away one world and revealed another. Boats that normally carried grain now carried limestone blocks. Farmers who usually guided plows now guided sledges loaded with obelisks. The flood was so central to Egyptian life that it became the foundation of their religion. The god Hapi, depicted as a blue-skinned man with pendulous breasts, symbolizing fertility, was responsible for the annual inundation. When the flood was good, Hapi was praised. When it failed, the entire kingdom could collapse into famine and civil war. Amenhotep had learned to read the river like a sacred text. The height of the flood was measured at Nilometers throughout the kingdom's stone-lined wells with graduated markings that allowed officials to predict the size of the harvest months in advance. A flood of 16 cubits meant abundance. 14 cubits meant hunger. 12 cubits meant disaster. But the Nile was more than just a source of water and soil. It was Egypt's highway, its communication network, its lifeline to the outside world. Boats carried everything: grain from the south, gold from Nubia, cedar wood from Lebanon, incense from Punt. The current carried vessels north toward the Mediterranean, while the prevailing winds allowed them to sail south against the flow. This geographic reality shaped Egyptian thinking in profound ways. North was downstream, toward the delta and the sea, the direction of endings and death. South was upstream, toward the source of the river and the heart of Africa, the direction of beginnings and life. The pharaoh wore two crowns: the white crown of Upper Egypt, the south, and the red crown of Lower Egypt, the north, symbolizing his control over the entire length of the river. The desert that bordered the Nile was not empty wasteland, but a sacred boundary between order and chaos. Here lived the gods of the dead, the dangerous spirits that could destroy the unwary, the wild animals that represented the untamed forces of nature. But the desert also provided Egypt with its greatest treasures: gold from the eastern hills, precious stones from the Red Sea mountains, and most importantly, the isolation that protected the kingdom from foreign invasion. For most Egyptians, the world beyond the Nile Valley might as well have been another planet. They lived their entire lives within a few miles of the river, their horizons bounded by the cliffs that rose on either side of the valley. This geographic isolation helped create a civilization of remarkable stability and continuity, a culture that would endure for 3,000 years with its essential character unchanged. In the great temple of Ptah in Memphis, where Amenhotep served as a junior scribe, the morning ritual began before dawn. The high priest, his head shaved and his body purified by ritual baths, approached the sanctuary where the god's statue resided. This was not worship as we understand it. This was the daily maintenance of cosmic order, the feeding and clothing of a divine being whose continued existence ensured the survival of Egypt itself. The pharaoh was not simply a king, he was a god walking among mortals, the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed deity who ruled the sky. When Tutankhamun sat on the throne of Egypt, he was not just governing a kingdom. He was maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and order that kept the universe from sliding back into primordial chaos. Ma'at was more than a concept, she was a goddess, depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather in her hair. This feather would later weigh the hearts of the dead, determining whether they had lived according to divine law. But Ma'at was also the foundation of daily life in Egypt, the principle that governed everything from royal decrees to market transactions. Every Egyptian, from the pharaoh to the humblest farmer, was expected to live according to Ma'at. This meant speaking truth, dealing fairly with others, caring for the poor and elderly, and maintaining the proper relationships between superiors and subordinates. It was a comprehensive moral system that touched every aspect of existence. The pharaoh's divine nature was not abstract theology, but practical politics. As the son of Ra, the sun god, he possessed the power to ensure the Nile's flood, to maintain Egypt's prosperity, to protect the kingdom from its enemies. His word was literally divine law, his commands carrying the weight of cosmic authority. But this divine power came with divine responsibility. The pharaoh was expected to rule according to Ma'at, to be the perfect king who embodied all virtues. If he failed in this duty, if he was cruel, unjust, or incompetent, the gods might withdraw their favor, leading to famine, invasion, or civil war. Tutankhamun, despite his youth, understood this burden. At 18, he had already restored the traditional gods after the religious revolution of his predecessor. Akhenaten, who had tried to replace Egypt's ancient pantheon with worship of a single deity. The Aten, the young pharaoh's name, meant living image of Amun, proclaiming his dedication to the old ways and the restoration of Mat. The Egyptian pantheon was vast and complex, with hundreds of gods and goddesses governing every aspect of existence. Ruled the sun and the day. Khonsu governed the moon and the night. Thoth was the god of wisdom and writing. Seshet was the goddess of libraries and measurement. Sobek protected the Nile's crocodiles. Tauret watched over pregnant women and children. But the gods were not distant, abstract beings. They lived in their temples, resided in their statues, and participated actively in Egyptian life. Each morning, priests would wake the god's statue, wash and dress it, offer it food and drink, and entertain it with music and dancing. The god would consume the spiritual essence of these offerings, leaving the physical food to be distributed among the temple staff. This daily ritual was replicated in thousands of temples throughout Egypt, creating a vast network of divine maintenance that employed tens of thousands of priests, scribes, musicians, and servants. The temples were not just religious centers, but economic powerhouses, owning vast estates, controlling trade routes, and managing the kingdom's grain reserves. Amenhotep's work in the temple involved more than just copying religious texts. He recorded the daily offerings, calculated the temple's income from its estates, and maintained correspondence with temples throughout Egypt. The gods, it seemed, required as much paperwork as any government bureaucracy. The relationship between the divine and mortal worlds was intimate and immediate. When a farmer's crop failed, it might be because he had offended a local god. When a woman had difficulty in childbirth, she would call upon Tauret for aid. When a scribe like Amenhotep faced a difficult text, he would pray to Thoth for wisdom. Magic was not separate from religion, but an integral part of it. Every Egyptian carried amulets for protection, knew spells for common problems, and understood that the proper words and rituals could influence the gods. The boundary between the natural and supernatural was fluid, permeable, constantly crossed by those who knew the right formulas. The afterlife was not a distant heaven, but a continuation of earthly existence under divine rule. The dead became servants of Osiris, the god of the underworld, working in the field of reeds, a perfected version of Egypt where the harvest was always abundant and the Nile always flooded at the proper time. This vision of divine order shaped every aspect of Egyptian society. The pharaoh ruled because the gods had chosen him. The priests served because the gods required their service. The farmers worked because the gods demanded their labor. Even the humblest Egyptian participated in maintaining Mat through their daily actions and moral choices. It was a system of remarkable stability and endurance, one that would survive conquest by Persians, Greeks, and Romans while maintaining its essential character. The gods of Egypt were not just objects of worship, but partners in the great work of keeping the universe running smoothly, ensuring that the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and life would continue in the narrow green valley that was the center of the world. In the house of the Vizier I, the most powerful man in Egypt after the pharaoh himself, the morning began with a ritual as elaborate as any temple ceremony. Servants brought water for washing, scribes presented reports from across the kingdom, and petitioners lined up in the courtyard, hoping for an audience with the man who spoke with the voice of the god king. Egyptian society was a pyramid as precisely constructed as those that rose from the Giza Plateau. At the apex sat the pharaoh, divine and untouchable. Below him, the vizier, the chief minister who managed the day-to-day administration of the kingdom. Then came the high priests, provincial governors, and military commanders, followed by scribes, craftsmen, farmers, and finally slaves, each level clearly defined, each person knowing exactly where they stood in the cosmic order. But this hierarchy was not rigid or oppressive in the way we might imagine. It was seen as a reflection of divine order, a necessary structure that allowed Mat to function properly. Each person had their role to play, their duties to fulfill, their place in the great machine that kept Egypt prosperous and stable. Amenhotep, as a scribe, occupied a privileged position in this hierarchy. The ability to read and write skills, possessed by perhaps 1% of the population, opened doors to advancement that would have been impossible for a farmer or laborer. Be a scribe, advised one ancient text, for it saves you from hard labor and protects you from all kinds of work. The path to becoming a scribe began early, usually around age 5, when promising boys, and occasionally girls, were sent to temple schools or the houses of established scribes. The education was rigorous and often brutal. Students learned to write by copying moral texts, religious hymns, and practical documents. They memorized thousands of hieroglyphic signs, practiced mathematics, studied geography, and learned the proper forms of address for different social ranks. The ears of a boy are on his back, went one saying. He listens when he is beaten. Physical punishment was considered essential to learning, and students who failed to master their lessons faced beatings with wooden rods. But those who succeeded could rise to positions of enormous influence and wealth. At the top of the social pyramid, the royal family lived in a world of unimaginable luxury. The pharaoh's palace in Memphis was a city within a city, with hundreds of rooms, vast gardens, artificial lakes, and quarters for thousands of servants, guards, and officials. The royal workshops produced goods of such exquisite craftsmanship that they were considered suitable offerings for the gods. Queen Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's young wife and half-sister, spent her days in the women's quarters of the palace, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, musicians, and servants. Her clothing was made from the finest linen, so sheer it was almost transparent, dyed with expensive pigments and decorated with gold thread. Her jewelry was crafted by the kingdom's master goldsmiths, incorporating precious stones from across the known world. But even royal women faced restrictions. They could not rule in their own right, with rare exceptions like Hatshepsut, could not appear in public without proper escort, and were expected to dedicate their lives to producing male heirs to continue the divine bloodline. Their power was real but indirect, exercised through influence over their husbands and sons. The nobility relatives of the royal family, high priests, and provincial governors lived in grand houses with multiple stories, courtyards, and private chapels. These were not just residences but centers of administration, where the business of governing Egypt was conducted. A nobleman's house might employ hundreds of people, scribes, accountants, guards, servants, craftsmen, and farmers working the estates that provided the family's wealth. Below the nobility came the professional classes scribes, like Amenhotep, skilled craftsmen, military officers, and temple officials. These were the people who actually ran Egypt on a day-to-day basis, who kept the records, collected the taxes, supervised the construction projects, and maintained the complex bureaucracy that held the kingdom together. A master craftsman could achieve considerable wealth and status. The royal workshops employed goldsmiths, jewelers, sculptors, painters, and furniture makers whose skills were legendary throughout the ancient world. These men, and they were almost always men, served long apprenticeships, learning not just technical skills, but the religious significance of their work. A sculptor creating a statue of a god was not just making art, he was creating a vessel for divine presence. The vast majority of Egyptians were farmers, living in small villages along the Nile, working fields that had been cultivated for thousands of years. Their lives were hard, but not hopeless. A successful farmer could own his own land, employ servants, and even send his sons to scribe school. The annual flood cycle provided a rhythm to their lives that was both predictable and meaningful. During the flood season, when their fields were underwater, farmers worked on royal construction projects not as slaves, but as paid laborers earning rations of bread, beer, and onions. This system, called corvée labor, was seen not as oppression but as a form of taxation, a way for ordinary Egyptians to contribute to the great monuments that would ensure the kingdom's eternal prosperity. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves, but even here the Egyptian system was more complex than simple bondage. Many slaves were prisoners of war or their descendants, but they could own property, marry free Egyptians, and even buy their freedom. Some slaves held positions of considerable responsibility, managing their masters' estates or serving as trusted advisors. The household of a wealthy Egyptian might include dozens of servants and slaves, doorkeepers, cooks, brewers, bakers, gardeners, musicians, dancers, and personal attendants. These people were considered part of the family, protected by law and custom, often freed in their master's will and sometimes buried in the family tomb. Social mobility was possible but limited. A talented scribe could rise to high office. A skilled craftsman could become wealthy. A successful farmer could buy land and slaves. But the basic structure of society remained stable, providing security and identity in a world where change was often associated with chaos and disaster. Women in Egypt enjoyed more rights than their counterparts in most ancient societies. They could own property, conduct business, initiate divorce, and serve as priestesses in temples. Some women, particularly in the royal family, wielded considerable political power. But they were still expected to focus primarily on marriage, childbearing, and household management. This social hierarchy was not just a human institution, but a reflection of divine order. The gods themselves were organized in a similar pyramid, with Re at the top, followed by the great gods like Amun, Pele, and Thoth, then lesser deities, and finally the countless spirits and demons that populated the Egyptian cosmos. Every Egyptian, regardless of their social position, participated in maintaining this divine order through their daily actions. The pharaoh performed the great rituals that kept the cosmos functioning. The priests maintained the temples. The scribes kept the records. The craftsmen created beautiful objects. The farmers fed the kingdom. Even slaves contributed through their labor. It was a system that provided stability, meaning, and purpose to millions of people across more than 3 millennia. The hierarchy of heaven and earth, as the Egyptians understood it, was not a burden to be endured, but a cosmic order to be celebrated. A divine plan in which every person had their role to play in the great drama of existence. Khemwaset was a farmer whose family had worked the same plot of land for 15 generations. Their names recorded in the village temple as far back as the reign of Amenhotep III. His fields lay in the fertile delta, where the Nile split into multiple channels before reaching the sea, creating a vast green triangle that was the breadbasket of Egypt and much of the ancient world. The year began with Akhet, the season of inundation, when the Nile rose from its banks and transformed Egypt into a vast inland sea. For 4 months, from July to October, Khemwaset's fields disappeared beneath the sacred waters, and with them disappeared one world while another was born. The flood was Egypt's miracle and mystery. Every year, without fail, the river would begin to rise just as the star Sopdet, Sirius, appeared on the eastern horizon before dawn. The Egyptians called this the Wep Ron Pet, the opening of the year, and it marked the beginning of their calendar, their agricultural cycle, and their religious year. But the flood was not just water, it was life itself. The river carried millions of tons of rich, black silt from the highlands of Ethiopia, depositing this fertile soil across the floodplain and renewing the earth for another year of cultivation. Without this annual gift from the gods, Egypt would have been nothing but desert, and one of history's greatest civilizations would never have existed. During the flood season, Khemwaset became a different person. No longer a farmer tied to his fields, he was free to work on the pharaoh's monuments, to travel to distant markets, to visit relatives in other villages. The flood transformed not just the landscape, but the entire rhythm of Egyptian life. Many farmers joined the great construction projects that employed tens of thousands of workers during the flood months. They hauled limestone blocks for pyramids, carved channels for irrigation canals, and built the temples and palaces that proclaimed Egypt's glory to the world. This was not slave labor, but paid work, providing farmers with income during the months when their fields were underwater. The flood also brought abundance in other forms. Fish spawned in the shallow waters covering the fields, providing protein for millions of people. Waterfowl nested in the temporary marshes, their eggs and meat supplementing the Egyptian diet. Wild plants grew in the rich mud, offering vegetables and medicines that could be gathered freely. Children looked forward to the flood season with special excitement. They could swim in waters that normally flowed far below the level of their villages, catch fish with their bare hands, and explore a landscape transformed into an aquatic wonderland. For them, the flood was not an economic necessity, but a magical time when the normal rules of life were suspended. But the flood was also a time of anxiety. Too little water meant famine. Too much meant destruction. The height of the flood was measured at nilometers throughout the Kingdom Stone Line, wells with graduated markings that allowed officials to predict the harvest months in advance. These measurements were reported to the pharaoh and recorded in temple archives, creating a database of flood levels that stretched back centuries. A flood of 16 cubits at the first cataract meant perfect conditions, enough water to irrigate all the fields, enough silt to renew the soil, but not so much as to destroy villages or delay planting. 14 cubits meant a lean year, with some fields remaining dry and the harvest reduced. 12 cubits meant disaster, widespread famine, social unrest, and the possible collapse of royal authority. The god Hapi, lord of the flood, was one of Egypt's most important deities, depicted as a blue-skinned man with pendulous breasts, symbolizing the fertility he brought to the land. Hymns to Hapi were sung throughout the flood season, praising him as the father of the gods, the creator of all good things, the source of life itself. Hail to you, Hapi! Went one ancient hymn, spring from the earth, come to nourish Egypt. Your flood advancing rejoices the fields which Ra created. All the thirsty ones drink their fill, and the earth is joyful. As the flood receded in late October, revealing the renewed fields covered with rich, black silt, the season of parade began, the time of growing, when Egypt's farmers raced to plant their crops before the soil dried out. This was a time of intense activity, with entire villages working together to prepare fields, sow seeds, and construct the irrigation channels that would carry water to their crops throughout the growing season. Kimwazet and his neighbors used simple but effective tools, wooden plows pulled by oxen to break up the soft, muddy soil, bronze hoes to create furrows, baskets to carry seed, and Shadouf's counterweighted poles with buckets to lift water from canals to higher fields. The main crops were emmer wheat and barley, which formed the foundation of the Egyptian diet. Wheat was made into bread, the staff of life for rich and poor alike. Barley was brewed into beer, which was safer to drink than water and provided essential nutrients. A typical Egyptian consumed several loaves of bread and several jars of beer every day. But Egyptian farmers also grew flax for linen, onions and garlic for flavoring, dates and figs for sweetness, and papyrus for writing material. The fertile soil and reliable irrigation allowed for intensive agriculture that could support a population density unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. The growing season required constant attention. Irrigation channels had to be maintained, weeds removed, birds scared away from ripening grain. Children and elderly people were employed as human scarecrows, standing in the fields and making noise to frighten away the flocks of birds that could destroy a crop in hours. Water management was a community effort requiring cooperation between villages and coordination by government officials. The irrigation system was a marvel of ancient engineering, a network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs that could distribute the Nile's water across millions of acres of farmland. Maintaining this system required the labor of thousands of people and the authority of the state to resolve disputes over water rights. In March, the season of Shemu began, the time of harvest, when 4 months of careful cultivation finally paid off. This was the most critical time of the agricultural year, when the entire crop had to be gathered, processed, and stored before the next flood arrived. The harvest was a community celebration as well as hard work. Entire families worked in the fields, cutting grain with bronze sickles, bundling it into sheaves, and loading it onto donkeys for transport to threshing floors. Songs were sung to make the work go faster, and the successful completion of the harvest was marked by festivals and feasting. Threshing was done by driving cattle over the grain to separate the kernels from the stalks, then winnowing, tossing the grain into the air so the wind could blow away the chaff. The clean grain was measured and recorded by scribes, with a portion going to the state as taxes, a portion to the temple as offerings, and the remainder stored for the farmer's own use. The agricultural cycle was not just about producing food, it was about maintaining the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous and stable. The successful completion of each season's work was seen as evidence that Mate was being properly maintained, that the gods were pleased with their people, and that the kingdom would continue to flourish. Khemwaset, like farmers throughout Egypt, understood that his work was sacred as well as practical. Every seed planted, every channel dug, every sheaf harvested was an act of cooperation with the gods, a contribution to the great work of keeping the universe running smoothly. The flood cycle created a civilization of remarkable stability and continuity. For 3,000 years, Egyptian farmers followed the same rhythm, used the same tools, worshipped the same gods, and lived according to the same cosmic order. It was this agricultural foundation that allowed Egypt to build its monuments, support its armies, and maintain its position as one of the ancient world's great powers. Nefertiti, not the famous queen, but a baker's wife in the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, began each day with a prayer to Renenutet, the cobra goddess who protected the harvest and ensured that bread would rise properly. Her small house shrine, carved into a niche in the mud brick wall, held a simple limestone statue of the goddess alongside offerings of bread, beer, and flowers. Religion in ancient Egypt was not a matter of weekly worship or annual festivals. It was woven into every moment of daily life, as essential as breathing and as constant as the Nile's flow. Every Egyptian, from the pharaoh to the humblest laborer, lived in a world where gods walked among mortals, where magic was as real as mathematics, and where the boundary between the sacred and secular simply did not exist. Nefertiti's day was punctuated by religious observances. Before lighting her oven, she spoke a charm to prevent the bread from burning. Before going to market, she touched the amulet of Bez, the dwarf god who protected households and children. Before sleeping, she recited a spell to ward off the demons that prowled in darkness. These were not superstitions, but practical applications of religious knowledge passed down through generations. Every Egyptian knew dozens of spells, charms, and protective formulas. They understood which gods to approach for different problems, which amulets to wear for various protections, and which rituals to perform for specific purposes. The Egyptian pantheon was vast and complex, with hundreds of deities governing every aspect of existence. But for ordinary people, religion was intensely personal and local. Each village had its own patron god, each profession its own divine protector, each household its own guardian spirits. Bez, the dwarf god with a lion's mane and a protruding tongue, was perhaps the most beloved deity in the Egyptian pantheon. He protected homes, families, and children, driving away evil spirits and bringing joy and laughter. His image appeared on everything from furniture to cosmetic containers, and his festivals were occasions for music, dancing, and celebration. Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess, watched over pregnant women and childbirth. Her fearsome appearance, the body of a pregnant hippo, the limbs of a lion, and the tail of a crocodile, was meant to frighten away the demons that threatened mothers and babies. Women in labor wore amulets of Tauret and called upon her protection during the dangerous hours of delivery. Sobek, the crocodile god, controlled the Nile's dangerous currents and the predators that lurked in its waters. Fishermen and sailors made offerings to Sobek before venturing onto the river, asking for safe passage and good catches. His temples, built near the water's edge, housed live crocodiles that were worshipped as incarnations of the god. The home was the center of religious life for most Egyptians. Every house had its shrine, usually a simple niche in the wall where the family's protective deities resided. These shrines held small statues, painted images, or even just symbolic objects representing the gods. Daily offerings of food, drink, and flowers kept the gods happy and ensured their continued protection. Family ancestors were also worshipped in the home. The spirits of dead relatives were believed to remain active in the lives of their descendants, offering guidance and protection, but also capable of causing problems if neglected. Letters to the dead, written on pottery shards or papyrus, asked deceased family members for help with everything from business disputes to romantic problems. Magic was not separate from religion, but an integral part of it. Every Egyptian knew that the proper words, gestures, and materials could influence the gods and change the course of events. Medical treatment combined practical remedies with magical spells. Legal contracts included curses against those who might break them. Even love letters contained charms to ensure the recipient's affection. The most important magical texts were the Books of Coming Forth by Day, what we call the Book of the Dead. These collections of spells and instructions were designed to help the deceased navigate the dangers of the afterlife and achieve eternal life. Wealthy Egyptians commissioned personalized versions, while poorer people made do with standard texts or even single spells written on scraps of papyrus. Festivals provided opportunities for entire communities to participate in religious celebrations. The most important was the Opet festival, when the god Amun traveled from his temple at Karnak to visit his wife Mut at Luxor Temple. The journey, made by boat along the Nile, was accompanied by music, dancing, and feasting that lasted for weeks. During festivals, the normally hidden statues of the gods were brought out in elaborate processions, allowing ordinary people to see and interact with their deities. These were occasions for asking the gods questions, seeking oracles, and receiving divine blessings. The gods would speak through the movements of their portable shrines, nodding yes or no to questions posed by worshippers. Dreams were considered direct communication from the gods. Professional dream interpreters worked in temples, helping people understand the messages they received during sleep. Dream books provided standard interpretations for common dream symbols, while unusual dreams might require consultation with priests or magicians. Nefertiti kept a dream journal, recording her nighttime visions and their subsequent interpretations. When she dreamed of bread turning to gold, the local priest explained that it meant prosperity was coming to her household. When she dreamed of crocodiles in her oven, it was a warning to be more careful with fire. Healing was a religious as well as medical practice. Physicians were often priests, and treatment combined practical remedies with magical spells. The god Thoth was invoked for wisdom and diagnosis, while Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, could both cause and cure diseases. Patients wore amulets, drank potions blessed by priests, and participated in healing rituals that addressed both physical and spiritual causes of illness. Death was not an ending but a transformation, a journey from one form of existence to another. The elaborate mummification process was designed to preserve the body for the afterlife, while magical spells and amulets protected the deceased during their journey through the underworld. Families maintained contact with their dead relatives through offerings and prayers, believing that the deceased continued to play active roles in the lives of the living. The afterlife was conceived as a perfected version of earthly existence. The dead would work in the field of reeds, a paradise where the harvest was always abundant and the Nile always flooded at the proper time. They would serve Osiris, the god of the underworld, but they would also continue to enjoy the pleasures of life, food, drink, music, and the company of loved ones. This vision of the afterlife shaped how Egyptians lived their earthly lives. They built tombs as houses for eternity, filled them with everything they would need in the next world, and lived according to Mat, to ensure they would be judged worthy of eternal life. For Nefertiti and millions of other Egyptians, religion was not a burden or obligation, but a source of comfort, meaning, and hope. It provided explanations for the mysteries of existence, protection against the dangers of life, and the promise that death was not the end, but the beginning of an even better existence. The gods were not distant, abstract beings, but intimate companions who shared in every aspect of human experience. They celebrated births, blessed marriages, protected travelers, healed the sick, and welcomed the dead into eternal life. In return, they asked only for recognition, respect, and the maintenance of Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the universe functioning properly. This integration of religion into every aspect of daily life created a civilization of remarkable stability and continuity. For 3,000 years, Egyptians found meaning and purpose in their relationship with the gods, building a culture that would outlast empires and continue to fascinate the world long after the last pharaoh had fallen and the last temple had crumbled into dust. In the royal workshops of Memphis, where the greatest treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb were being crafted, Master goldsmith Amenemheb bent over his workbench, carefully hammering a sheet of gold so thin it was almost transparent. The piece he was creating, a pectoral ornament depicting the pharaoh as a sphinx trampling his enemies, would require months of work and represent the pinnacle of Egyptian craftsmanship. Egyptian artisans were not mere workers but priests of creation, transforming raw materials into objects of such beauty and perfection that they were considered suitable offerings for the gods. Their workshops were temples of craftsmanship where ancient techniques were passed down from master to apprentice across generations, where every tool was sacred and every creation was an act of worship. Amenemheb had begun his training at age 7, starting as a simple apprentice who swept floors and prepared materials. For years, he had watched and learned, gradually being allowed to perform simple tasks under the watchful eye of his master. By age 15, he could work gold with skill that would have been considered miraculous in any other civilization. Now at 30, he was one of the most respected craftsmen in Egypt, his work destined for the pharaoh's tomb and eternal life. The Egyptian mastery of goldworking was legendary throughout the ancient world. They had developed techniques for creating alloys, for granulation, decorating surfaces with tiny gold spheres, for filigree, creating delicate patterns with gold wire, and for cloison, setting precious stones in gold cells. Their jewelry was so sophisticated that modern craftsmen struggled to replicate their techniques. Gold was more than a precious metal to the Egyptians. It was the flesh of the gods, imperishable and eternal. The pharaoh's burial mask, crafted from 11 kilograms of solid gold, was not just a funeral ornament, but a magical transformation that would allow the king to become one with Ra, the sun god, in the afterlife. The workshops where such treasures were created were marvels of organization and specialization. Different craftsmen handled different aspects of the work. Some prepared the gold, others created the basic forms, still others added decorative details. Master craftsmen like Amenemheb supervised the entire process, ensuring that every piece met the exacting standards required for royal commissions. But goldworking was just one of dozens of crafts that reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in ancient Egypt. Stone carvers created statues of such perfection that they seemed to breathe. Painters developed techniques for creating colors so vivid they still dazzle viewers 4,000 years later. Furniture makers crafted chairs, beds, and chests that combined beauty with functionality in ways that would not be surpassed until the Renaissance. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered intact by Howard Carter in 1922, provides a window into the incredible skill of Egyptian craftsmen. The tomb contained over 5,000 objects, each one a masterpiece of design and execution. Golden thrones, jeweled daggers, carved chests, painted boxes, every item demonstrated the extraordinary level of craftsmanship that Egyptian artisans could achieve. Egyptian painters developed a sophisticated color palette using minerals and organic materials. Red came from iron oxide, blue from ground lapis lazuli, yellow from orpiment, green from malachite, black from charcoal, and white from chalk or gypsum. These pigments were mixed with binders like egg white or plant gums to create paints that would last for millennia. The techniques of Egyptian painting were highly standardized, with strict rules governing proportions, colors, and subject matter. Figures were depicted according to a canon of proportions, based on a grid system, ensuring that every representation of a god or pharaoh conformed to divine standards. Yet within these constraints, individual artists found ways to express creativity and personality. Sculpture reached its highest expression in the workshops of royal craftsmen. The colossal statues of pharaohs that lined temple avenues were carved from single blocks of granite or quartzite, requiring teams of sculptors working for years to complete. The precision of their work was extraordinary. Statues weighing hundreds of tons were carved with details so fine they could only be appreciated at close range. The famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thomos at Amarna, demonstrates the incredible skill of Egyptian portrait sculptors. The piece combines idealized beauty with individual personality, creating an image that is both divine and human, eternal and immediate. Furniture making was another craft that reached extraordinary heights in Egypt. The chairs, beds, and chests found in royal tombs demonstrate sophisticated joinery techniques, elegant proportions, and decorative details of incredible complexity. Egyptian furniture makers used a variety of woods, some local, like sycamore and tamarisk, others imported from distant lands, like cedar from Lebanon and ebony from Africa. The golden throne of Tutankhamun, with its intricate inlays and sculptural details, represents the pinnacle of Egyptian furniture making. The piece combines multiple crafts: woodworking, goldsmithing, jewelry making, and painting in a single object that serves both practical and symbolic functions. Textile production was largely the domain of women, who created linen of such fineness that it was almost transparent. Egyptian flax was considered the best in the ancient world, and Egyptian linen was exported throughout the Mediterranean. The mummy wrappings of pharaohs were made from linen so fine that it took skilled weavers months to produce enough for a single burial. The process of creating fine linen began with the cultivation of flax, continued through the harvesting and processing of the fibers, and culminated in the weaving of cloth on horizontal looms. The finest linen was bleached white and could be pleated into intricate patterns that required extraordinary skill to create and maintain. Egyptian craftsmen also excelled in the production of glass and faience, a glazed ceramic material that could be molded into intricate shapes and colored with metallic oxides. Glassmaking was a closely guarded secret, with techniques passed down within families of craftsmen. Egyptian glass vessels, jewelry, and decorative objects were prized throughout the ancient world. Faience was used to create everything from jewelry and amulets to architectural tiles and decorative vessels. The material could be molded into complex shapes and fired to create a brilliant blue-green glaze that was associated with rebirth and eternal life. Faience objects were often placed in tombs to ensure the deceased's resurrection in the afterlife. Trade was essential to Egyptian craftsmanship, as many of the materials required for the finest work had to be imported from distant lands. Gold came from Nubia, silver from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, ivory from Africa, and incense from the mysterious land of Punt. Egyptian merchants traveled throughout the known world, establishing trading posts and maintaining relationships with suppliers of exotic materials. The pharaoh's expeditions to Punt, depicted in the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, show Egyptian traders returning with incense trees, gold, ivory, and exotic animals. The organization of craft production was highly sophisticated, with royal workshops, temple workshops, and private workshops all contributing to Egypt's artistic output. The royal workshops produced objects for the pharaoh and his court. Temple workshops created religious objects and maintained temple decorations, while private workshops served the needs of wealthy individuals and the export trade. Craftsmen were organized into guilds that regulated training, maintained quality standards, and protected trade secrets. A master craftsman's workshop was not just a place of production, but a school where the next generation learned the skills that had been perfected over millennia. The legacy of Egyptian craftsmanship extends far beyond the objects that survive in museums. The techniques developed by Egyptian artisans influenced Greek, Roman, and Islamic art. The aesthetic principles they established, the integration of beauty and function, the use of symbolic decoration, the pursuit of perfection in every detail, continue to inspire artists and craftsmen today. Amenemheb, working by lamplight in his workshop, understood that he was not just creating beautiful objects, but participating in the eternal work of the gods. Every piece he crafted was a prayer. Every technique he mastered was a form of worship. Every apprentice he trained was a link in the chain that connected the present to the divine past and the eternal future. The artisans of ancient Egypt were indeed craftsmen of eternity, creating objects of such beauty and perfection that they continue to inspire wonder and admiration, 4,000 years after their makers returned to dust. Their workshops were temples, their tools were sacred implements, and their creations were offerings to the gods and to the future generations who would marvel at their skill and dedication. In the House of Life attached to the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, 12-year-old Kamwaset bent over his writing board, carefully copying the maxims of Ptahhotep, the ancient vizier whose wisdom had guided Egyptian scribes for over 1,000 years. His hand ached from gripping the reed pen, his back was sore from hunching over his work, and his knuckles bore the marks of his teacher's rod. But he was learning to wield the most powerful tool in the Egyptian world, the written word. Be skilled in speech so that you will succeed, he copied in careful hieroglyphs. The tongue of a man is his steering oar, and effective speech is his strength. These were not just writing exercises but lessons in how to live, how to succeed, and how to maintain the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous and stable. To be a scribe in ancient Egypt was to hold the keys to immortality. While farmers and craftsmen created things that would decay and crumble, scribes created words that would last forever. They were the memory of the kingdom, the guardians of knowledge, the bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. The path to becoming a scribe was long and difficult. It began early, usually around age 5, when promising boys, and occasionally girls, were identified and sent to temple schools or the houses of established scribes. The selection process was rigorous. Only children who showed exceptional intelligence, good memory, and steady hands were chosen for this privileged education. The curriculum was comprehensive and demanding. Students learned to read and write in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphic, the sacred writing of the gods; hieratic, the cursive script used for daily business; and later Demotic, the popular script of commerce and literature. They studied mathematics, astronomy, geography, history, literature, and law. They memorized thousands of texts, from religious hymns to administrative procedures. Physical punishment was considered essential to learning. The ears of a boy are on his back, went the saying. He listens when he is beaten. Teachers carried rods and used them freely on students who failed to master their lessons. The education was harsh, but it produced scribes whose skills were legendary throughout the ancient world. Kamwaset's day began before dawn with ritual purification, washing his hands and mouth, putting on clean linen, and saying prayers to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing. The scribal profession was sacred, and its practitioners were expected to maintain ritual purity as well as intellectual excellence. The first lessons involved learning the hieroglyphic alphabet, not truly an alphabet, but a complex system of over 700 signs that could represent sounds, words, or ideas. Each sign had to be memorized perfectly, along with its various meanings and the context in which it could be used. A single mistake could change the meaning of an entire text, so precision was essential. Mathematics was taught through practical problems that scribes would encounter in their careers. How much grain could be stored in a granary of given dimensions? How many workers were needed to build a pyramid in 20 years? How should land be divided among heirs? These were not abstract exercises but real challenges that scribes would face when they entered government service. Egyptian mathematics was surprisingly sophisticated. They understood fractions, could calculate areas and volumes, and had developed methods for solving complex problems involving proportions and percentages. The Moscow and Rhine papyri, mathematical textbooks that survive from this period, demonstrate a level of mathematical knowledge that would not be surpassed in Europe until the Renaissance. Astronomy was another essential subject, as scribes were responsible for maintaining the calendar and predicting the annual flood. They learned to track the movements of stars and planets, to calculate the length of the year, and to determine the proper dates for religious festivals. The appearance of Sirius on the eastern horizon before dawn marked the beginning of the Egyptian year and the start of the flood season. The Egyptian calendar was one of the most accurate in the ancient world, consisting of 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days at the end of the year. This 365-day calendar was only about 6 hours shorter than the actual solar year, making it far more accurate than the lunar calendars used by most other ancient civilizations. Geography was taught through the copying of maps and the memorization of trade routes. Scribes needed to know the locations of cities, temples, and administrative centers throughout Egypt and beyond. They studied the sources of the Nile, the routes to Nubia and the Levant, and the locations of quarries and mines that supplied the kingdom's raw materials. History was preserved in king lists and chronicles that recorded the deeds of pharaohs and the major events of each reign. Students memorized the names and accomplishments of rulers stretching back to the legendary first pharaoh, Menes, who had united Upper and Lower Egypt. This historical knowledge was essential for understanding legal precedents and administrative procedures. Literature was perhaps the most enjoyable part of the curriculum. Students read and copied the great works of Egyptian literature, the adventures of Sina, the complaints of the eloquent peasant, the wisdom literature of the sages. These texts were not just entertainment, but moral instruction, teaching proper behavior and the values that held Egyptian society together. The story of Sinu, about an Egyptian official who fled to foreign lands and eventually returned home, was particularly popular. It taught lessons about loyalty to the pharaoh, the superiority of Egyptian civilization, and the importance of proper burial in Egyptian soil. Students would copy this text multiple times, learning not just the story but the elegant language in which it was told. Law was a practical subject that all scribes needed to master. They learned the principles of Ma'at that governed Egyptian justice, the procedures for conducting trials, and the proper forms for legal documents. Many scribes would spend their careers in law courts, serving as judges, advocates, or record keepers. Egyptian law was based on precedent and custom rather than written codes. Scribes needed to memorize hundreds of legal decisions and understand how they applied to new situations. The ability to cite relevant precedents and argue cases persuasively was essential for success in the legal profession. Medicine was another field that required scribal training. Egyptian physicians were often scribes who had specialized in medical texts. They learned anatomy from mummification procedures, studied the properties of medicinal plants, and memorized spells and incantations that were believed to aid in healing. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text that survives from this period, demonstrates the sophisticated understanding of anatomy and surgery that Egyptian physicians possessed. It describes treatments for wounds, fractures, and other injuries with a level of detail and accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Religious texts formed a major part of the scribal curriculum. Students learned the hymns sung in temples, the spells used in funerary rituals, and the complex theology that explained the relationships between gods and mortals. Many scribes would serve in temples, where their ability to read and write sacred texts was essential for maintaining proper worship. The pyramid texts, carved in the burial chambers of Old Kingdom pharaohs, represent some of the oldest religious literature in the world. These spells and incantations were designed to ensure the king's successful journey to the afterlife and his transformation into a god. Later scribes would adapt these texts for use by ordinary Egyptians, creating the coffin texts and eventually the Book of the Dead. After years of training, successful students would graduate to become junior scribes in government offices, temples, or private households. They might serve as accountants, keeping track of taxes and expenditures. They might become secretaries, drafting letters and documents for their superiors. They might specialize in particular fields like law, medicine, or engineering. The most successful scribes could rise to positions of enormous power and influence. The vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister, was always a scribe. So were the governors of provinces, the high priests of major temples, and the commanders of military expeditions. The ability to read and write was the key that unlocked the highest levels of Egyptian society. Khumwaset, now in his final year of training, dreamed of serving in the royal administration. He had mastered the 3 scripts, excelled in mathematics and astronomy, and shown particular talent for legal reasoning. His teachers spoke of recommending him for a position in the vizier's office, where he might eventually rise to become a judge or provincial governor. But first, he had to complete his final examination, a comprehensive test of everything he had learned over 7 years of study. He would be required to demonstrate his mastery of writing, mathematics, law, history, and literature. Only those who passed this examination would be admitted to the ranks of professional scribes. The scribal profession was more than just a career, it was a calling, a sacred duty to preserve and transmit the knowledge that kept Egyptian civilization functioning. Scribes were the guardians of memory, the keepers of wisdom, the bridge between past and future. Their work ensured that the deeds of pharaohs would be remembered, that the wisdom of sages would be preserved, that the laws and customs of Egypt would be passed down to future generations. Without scribes, Egyptian civilization would have been as ephemeral as the annual flood, leaving no trace of its existence. The house of life where Khumwaset studied was more than a school, it was a repository of human knowledge, a place where the accumulated wisdom of 3,000 years was preserved and transmitted. Here, young minds were shaped to carry forward the intellectual traditions that made Egypt the most advanced civilization of the ancient world. As the sun set over Memphis, casting long shadows across the temple complex, Khumwaset put down his pen and rolled up his papyrus. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to master the skills that would make him one of the elite few who could read the words of the gods and write the records of eternity. At the great harbor of Memphis, where the Nile bent eastward toward the delta, merchant ships from across the known world crowded the docks like a forest of masts and rigging. Phoenician vessels from Byblos unloaded cedar logs that would become the coffins of pharaohs. Nubian traders displayed gold, ivory, and exotic animals from the heart of Africa. Mesopotamian merchants offered lapis lazuli, silver, and the finest textiles from the looms of Babylon. We, a merchant whose family had traded along the Nile for 5 generations, moved through this cosmopolitan chaos with the confidence of a man who spoke 6 languages and could calculate exchange rates in his head. His warehouse near the harbor held treasures from a dozen lands: frankincense from Punt, copper from Cyprus, tin from distant Britain, and spices from the mysterious lands beyond the Persian Gulf. Egypt was the crossroads of the ancient world, the hub of a trading network that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The kingdom's strategic position at the junction of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean made it the natural meeting place for merchants from every corner of the known world. But Egypt was more than just a marketplace. It was the economic engine that drove international commerce throughout the Bronze Age. The foundation of Egypt's commercial power was agricultural surplus. The annual Nile flood produced far more grain than the kingdom's population could consume, creating a massive export commodity that was in constant demand throughout the ancient world. Egyptian wheat fed the cities of the Levant, the islands of the Aegean, and the growing populations of Mesopotamia. But Egypt exported far more than grain. The kingdom's craftsmen produced luxury goods that were prized throughout the ancient world. Fine linen that was softer than silk, jewelry of exquisite workmanship, furniture of elegant design, and papyrus, the writing material that made literacy possible across the Mediterranean. Egyptian linen was particularly sought after. Made from flax grown in the fertile delta, it could be woven so fine that it was almost transparent. The mummy wrappings of pharaohs required hundreds of yards of the finest linen, while ordinary Egyptians wore coarser grades that were still superior to the textiles produced in most other countries. Papyrus was another uniquely Egyptian export. The tall reeds that grew in the Nile marshes were processed into a writing material that was lighter than clay tablets, more durable than animal skins, and cheaper than parchment. Egyptian papyrus became the standard writing material throughout the ancient world, making Egypt the supplier of literacy itself. The process of making papyrus was closely guarded secret. The reeds were cut into strips, laid in perpendicular layers, pressed and dried to create sheets that could be joined into long rolls. The finest papyrus, made from the inner pith of young reeds, was reserved for royal documents and religious texts. Gold was Egypt's most precious export. The desert hills east of the Nile contained some of the richest gold deposits in the ancient world, and Egyptian miners had been extracting the precious metal for over 1,000 years. Nubian gold from the kingdom's southern territories was even more prized for its purity and abundance. The pharaoh's control over gold production gave him enormous diplomatic leverage. Gold was the international currency of the Bronze Age, used to seal treaties, purchase alliances, and demonstrate royal power. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, are filled with requests from foreign kings for Egyptian gold. Egypt's imports were as diverse as its exports. The kingdom lacked many raw materials that were essential for its civilization. Silver came from Anatolia, copper from Cyprus, tin from as far away as Britain and Afghanistan. Cedar wood for shipbuilding and construction came from the forests of Lebanon. Incense and exotic animals came from the mysterious land of Punt, probably located in modern-day Somalia or Ethiopia. The most spectacular trading expeditions were those sent to Punt, the god's land, that supplied Egypt with frankincense, myrrh, gold, ivory, and exotic animals. These expeditions, organized by the pharaoh himself, involved hundreds of men and dozens of ships. The Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari depicts one such expedition, showing Egyptian traders returning with incense trees, baboons, and other treasures. Trade routes connected Egypt to every corner of the ancient world. The Nile itself was the kingdom's main highway, carrying goods from Nubia in the south to the Mediterranean in the north. From there, ships could reach any port in the known world. Overland routes crossed the Sinai Peninsula to reach the Levant, while desert tracks connected Egypt to the Red Sea ports that traded with Arabia and India. The organization of trade was sophisticated and complex. The pharaoh controlled the most valuable commodities, gold, silver, and precious stones, through royal monopolies. Temples managed much of the agricultural trade, using their vast estates and storage facilities to collect and distribute grain. Private merchants like we handled everything else, from luxury goods to everyday necessities. Currency in ancient Egypt was based on weight rather than coinage. The standard units were the deben, about 91 grams, and the shat, about 7.6 grams, usually measured in copper, silver, or gold. Prices were quoted in these units, but actual payment might be made in goods of equivalent value. A cow might be worth 100 deben of copper, a jar of honey 5 deben, a pair of sandals 2 deben. This barter system was more flexible than it might appear. Merchants like we carried scales and weights to determine the value of goods, and they understood the complex exchange rates between different commodities. A skilled trader could make a profit by understanding regional price differences and seasonal variations in supply and demand. The harbor at Memphis was a microcosm of the ancient world. Here, Egyptian officials checked manifests and collected taxes. Foreign merchants established temporary shops to display their wares. Interpreters helped negotiate deals between traders who spoke different languages. Money changers converted between different weight standards and metal values. The diversity was extraordinary. Nubian traders, their skin darkened by the African sun, displayed gold nuggets and ivory tusks. Phoenician merchants, their ships reeking of cedar and purple dye, offered textiles and metalwork from the cities of the Levant. Mesopotamian traders brought cuneiform tablets, recording contracts and correspondence from the great cities of Babylon and Assyria. Egyptian merchants were respected throughout the ancient world for their honesty and reliability. The kingdom's stable government, predictable laws, and sophisticated bureaucracy made it an ideal place to do business. Foreign traders knew that contracts would be honored, disputes would be settled fairly, and their goods would be protected by Egyptian law. The legal framework supporting commerce was highly developed. Contracts were written in multiple copies and witnessed by officials. Dispute resolution mechanisms existed for settling disagreements between merchants. International treaties included provisions for protecting traders and their goods in foreign territories. Women played important roles in Egyptian commerce, particularly in retail trade and textile production. They could own property, conduct business, and enter into contracts in their own names. Some of the wealthiest merchants in Egypt were women who had inherited businesses from their husbands or fathers and expanded them through their own efforts. We's own wife, Nefertiti, managed the textile side of their business, overseeing the production of fine linen and the import of exotic fabrics from abroad. She employed dozens of weavers and had established trading relationships with suppliers throughout the Mediterranean. Her business acumen was legendary in Memphis's merchant community. The seasonal rhythm of trade followed the Nile's flood cycle. During the inundation, when transportation was easy and labor was available, major trading expeditions were organized. The harvest season brought a flood of agricultural exports. The dry season was the time for overland trade and the maintenance of commercial relationships. This predictable cycle allowed merchants to plan their activities years in advance. They knew when to expect certain goods, when to send out trading expeditions, and when to stockpile commodities for seasonal price variations. The stability of the Egyptian economy made long-term planning possible in a way that was impossible in less stable regions. The wealth generated by trade supported Egypt's magnificent civilization. The profits from commerce funded the construction of temples and pyramids, supported the royal court, and maintained the army that protected the kingdom's trade routes. Without the economic foundation provided by international trade, Egypt could never have achieved its cultural and artistic heights. We understood that he was more than just a merchant. He was an agent of Egyptian civilization, spreading the kingdom's influence throughout the known world. Every transaction he completed, every relationship he built, every profit he made contributed to the glory and power of the pharaoh and the gods who protected Egypt. As the sun set over the harbor at Memphis, painting the Nile gold and crimson, we tallied the day's profits and planned tomorrow's activities. Ships would arrive from Nubia with gold and ivory. Caravans would depart for the Levant with grain and linen. The great wheel of international commerce would continue to turn, with Egypt at its center, the marketplace of the ancient world. In a comfortable house in the artisans' quarter of Deir el-Medina, Sanab the sculptor sat with his wife Senais and their 3 children, sharing the evening meal that marked the end of another day's work on the royal tombs. The house, built of mud brick and whitewashed to reflect the desert heat, was modest by royal standards but luxurious compared to the homes of ordinary farmers, a reflection of the special status enjoyed by the craftsmen, who created the pharaoh's eternal resting place. Family was the foundation of Egyptian society, the basic unit around which all life was organized. The Egyptian word for house also meant family, reflecting the intimate connection between physical space and social relationships. A person's identity was defined not just by their own achievements, but by their place in the complex web of family relationships that stretched back to the ancestors and forward to future generations. Marriage in ancient Egypt was both a practical arrangement and a romantic partnership. Unlike many ancient societies, Egyptians valued love and affection between spouses, as evidenced by the love poetry that survives from this period. "My heart remembers your love," wrote one ancient poet. "One half of it is yours. The other half is yours also." Sonab and Senates had married for love as well as practical considerations. Both came from families of skilled craftsmen, ensuring that their children would inherit not just property, but the specialized knowledge needed to continue the family traditions. Their marriage had been arranged by their parents, but had blossomed into genuine affection and partnership. The marriage ceremony itself was surprisingly simple. There was no religious ritual, no priestly blessing, no elaborate legal contract. Marriage was essentially a matter of a woman moving into a man's house and being accepted as his wife by the community. The couple might exchange gifts, hold a feast for family and friends, and make offerings to household gods, but these were celebrations rather than requirements. What mattered was not the ceremony but the commitment. Egyptian marriage was based on the principle of mutual respect and shared responsibility. Husbands were expected to provide for their wives and children, while wives managed the household and raised the children. Both partners could own property, conduct business, and make decisions about family matters. Divorce was possible and relatively straightforward. Either partner could initiate divorce, though men had somewhat more freedom in this regard. A divorced woman retained her personal property and could return to her family or remarry. Children usually remained with their father, but mothers retained visitation rights and could influence their upbringing. The legal protections for women in marriage were remarkably advanced for the ancient world. A wife could not be sold or abandoned without cause. She had the right to her own property and could dispose of it as she wished. If her husband died, she inherited a portion of his estate and could serve as guardian for their minor children. Children were the greatest blessing an Egyptian couple could receive. They were seen not just as heirs to family property, but as guarantees of immortality, the ones who would maintain the family tomb, make offerings to deceased ancestors, and carry the family name into the future. Childlessness was considered a tragedy, and couples would go to great lengths to have children. Senab and Senates had been blessed with 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The eldest son, Amenhotep, was already showing talent as a sculptor and would likely follow his father into the royal workshops. The younger son, Kanweset, was being trained as a scribe, ensuring that the family would have connections in the government bureaucracy. Their daughter, Nefertiti, was learning the skills of household management that would make her a desirable wife. Pregnancy and childbirth were times of both joy and anxiety. Egyptian women had access to sophisticated medical knowledge about pregnancy and delivery, but infant and maternal mortality remained high. Pregnant women wore amulets of Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess who protected mothers and children, and made offerings to Bes, the dwarf god who brought good fortune to families. The birth itself took place in a special pavilion or birth house, attended by midwives and female relatives. Pain relief was provided through a combination of herbal remedies and magical spells. The moment of birth was considered magically dangerous, when evil spirits might try to harm the mother or child, so protective rituals were performed throughout the process. The survival of the first few days was critical. If the child lived for a week, a naming ceremony was held where the baby received its official name and was formally accepted into the family. Names were chosen carefully, often incorporating the names of gods or expressing hopes for the child's future. Amenhotep meant, Amen is satisfied, while Nefertiti meant the beautiful one has come. Childhood in ancient Egypt was a time of gradual introduction to adult responsibilities. Very young children of both sexes played together, often naked in the warm climate, with toys that included dolls, balls, board games, and miniature tools. As they grew older, boys and girls were separated and began learning the skills they would need as adults. Education began early and was highly valued. Wealthy families hired private tutors or sent their children to temple schools. Less affluent families taught their children the family trade through apprenticeship and hands-on experience. Even poor families made efforts to ensure their children learned basic skills like counting and simple writing. Boys typically followed their father's occupations, learning through observation and practice. A farmer's son learned to plow and plant. A craftsman's son learned to work with tools. A scribe's son learned to read and write. This system ensured that specialized knowledge was preserved and passed down through generations. Girls learned the skills of household management from their mothers and female relatives. They learned to cook, weave, manage servants, and raise children. But they also learned business skills, as many women were involved in trade and commerce. Some girls from wealthy families even learned to read and write, though this was less common than for boys. The relationship between parents and children was affectionate but hierarchical. Children were expected to obey their parents and show them respect throughout their lives. The wisdom literature of ancient Egypt is filled with advice about proper behavior toward parents. Do not forget your mother who bore you, who nurtured you in all ways. If you forget her, she might blame you before God. Coming of age was marked by different rituals for boys and girls. Boys underwent circumcision, usually around age 10 or 12, in a ceremony that marked their transition from childhood to adolescence. Girls' coming of age was marked by their first menstruation, after which they were considered ready for marriage and motherhood. Marriage typically occurred in the late teens or early 20s. Parents played important roles in arranging marriages, but young people had some say in the choice of partners. Love matches were not uncommon, and the literature of the period includes many examples of romantic poetry and love songs. The extended family was crucial to Egyptian social organization. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all played important roles in raising children and supporting the family unit. Elderly relatives were particularly respected for their wisdom and experience, and caring for aging parents was considered a sacred duty. Family gatherings were important social events, particularly during religious festivals. The entire extended family would come together to celebrate, share meals, exchange gifts, and strengthen family bonds. These occasions also provided opportunities for arranging marriages and conducting family business. Death was not seen as the end of family relationships, but as a transition to a different form of existence. The deceased remained part of the family, receiving offerings and prayers from their descendants. Family tombs were designed as eternal homes where multiple generations could be buried together. The cult of the ancestors was central to Egyptian family life. Dead relatives were believed to continue watching over their families, offering protection and guidance from the afterlife. Letters to the dead, written on pottery shards or papyrus, asked deceased family members for help with everything from business problems to romantic difficulties. Seneb's own father had died 5 years earlier, but his presence was still felt in the household. His mummy rested in the family tomb in the hills above Deir el-Medina, and offerings were made to him regularly. His tools were preserved in the house, and his techniques were still taught to the younger generation. Death had not broken the family bonds, but had transformed them. The house itself reflected the importance of family relationships. The main room contained a shrine to the household gods and ancestors. Family possessions were displayed prominently, including heirlooms passed down through generations. The decoration of the walls often included family scenes and portraits of deceased relatives. Women's roles in the family were complex and varied. While they were expected to focus primarily on domestic duties, they also had significant authority within the household. They managed family finances, supervised servants, and made important decisions about children's education and marriages. Some women also pursued careers outside the home while maintaining their family responsibilities. Senates, for example, not only managed her household but also worked as a weaver, producing fine linen that was sold in the markets of Thebes. Her income contributed significantly to the family's prosperity and allowed them to afford luxuries like imported spices and fine furniture. The Egyptian family was remarkably stable and enduring. Unlike many ancient societies where political upheavals regularly disrupted family life, Egypt's stability allowed families to maintain their traditions and properties across many generations. Some families could trace their lineages back hundreds of years, with detailed records of ancestors and their achievements. This stability was both a strength and a limitation. It provided security and continuity, but could also restrict individual freedom and innovation. Young people were expected to follow family traditions and maintain established relationships, even when they might prefer different paths. As night fell over Deir el-Medina, Seneb's family gathered for evening prayers, thanking the gods for another day of health and prosperity. The children recited the names of their ancestors, ensuring that the dead would not be forgotten. Senates checked on the household shrine, making sure the offerings were fresh and the lamps were lit. This daily ritual, repeated in thousands of homes throughout Egypt, was the foundation upon which the entire civilization rested. The family was not just a social unit, but a religious institution, an economic partnership, and a bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. The house of life and death, as Egyptians understood it, was not just a physical structure, but a spiritual reality that connected past, present, and future in an unbroken chain of love, duty, and remembrance. In this understanding, every family was eternal, every child was a gift from the gods, and every home was a temple where the sacred and secular merged into the daily miracle of human existence. In the house of purification on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, where the sun set each evening into the realm of the dead, the master embalmer Eufa prepared to begin the most sacred of all Egyptian rituals. Before him lay the body of Amenhotep, a wealthy merchant who had died after a brief illness. His family gathered in grief, but also in hope, for death in Egypt was not an ending but a transformation, the beginning of a journey to eternal life. The process of mummification was more than preservation, it was resurrection, a magical transformation that would allow the deceased to live forever in the company of the gods. Every step was prescribed by ancient ritual, every material was sacred. Every word spoken was a spell that would help the dead navigate the dangers of the underworld and achieve immortality. Death in ancient Egypt was understood not as the cessation of life, but as a transition from one form of existence to another. The Egyptians believed that each person possessed multiple souls: the Ka, life force; the Ba, personality; and the Ak, transfigured spirit. Death separated these elements, but proper mummification and burial rituals could reunite them in the afterlife. The process began immediately after death, when the body was taken to the house of purification, a sacred building located on the west bank of the Nile, the site associated with death and the setting sun. Here, professional embalmers like Eufa would spend 70 days transforming a corpse into a mummy, using techniques that had been perfected over thousands of years. The first step was the removal of the internal organs, which would decay quickly in Egypt's hot climate. Using a long bronze hook inserted through the nose, the embalmers extracted the brain, which the Egyptians considered unimportant. The abdomen was then opened with a sharp obsidian knife, and the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were carefully removed. These organs were not discarded, but were themselves mummified and placed in 4 canopic jars, each protected by a different god. Imsidi, human-headed, guarded the liver; Hapi, baboon-headed, protected the lungs; Duamutef, jackal-headed, watched over the stomach; and Kebisinuf, falcon-headed, safeguarded the intestines. The heart, considered the seat of intelligence and emotion, was usually left in the body or replaced with a heart scarab, a stone amulet inscribed with spells that would help the deceased in the judgment of the dead. The heart would be weighed against the feather of Mat in the afterlife, determining whether the person had lived a righteous life and deserved eternal existence. After the organs were removed, the body was packed with natron, a naturally occurring salt that would dry out the tissues and prevent decay. The body was left in natron for 40 days, during which time the salt would absorb all moisture, leaving behind a dried but intact corpse that could last for thousands of years. While the body was drying, the family made preparations for the funeral. They commissioned a coffin, gathered burial goods, arranged for the copying of funerary texts, and prepared the tomb that would serve as the deceased's eternal home. The quality and expense of these preparations depended on the family's wealth and social status. Wealthy individuals like Amenhotep could afford elaborate mummification, multiple coffins, extensive burial goods, and tombs decorated with beautiful paintings and inscriptions. Poor people received simpler treatment. Their bodies might be dried in natron but not carefully wrapped, and they might be buried in simple graves with minimal grave goods. After 40 days in natron, the body was removed and carefully cleaned. The dried skin was often darkened and brittle, so it was treated with oils and resins to restore flexibility and appearance. The body cavity was stuffed with linen, sawdust, or other materials to restore its natural shape. The wrapping process was the most complex and sacred part of mummification. Hundreds of yards of fine linen were used to wrap the body, with each finger and toe wrapped individually before the entire limb was covered. Between the layers of linen, amulets were placed to protect the deceased in the afterlife, scarabs for the heart, jed pillars for stability, ankh symbols for life. The most important amulet was placed over the heart, a heart scarab inscribed with Chapter 3:0b of the Book of the Dead, which would prevent the heart from testifying against the deceased during the judgment of the dead. "O my heart, which I had from my mother," the spell read, "do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal." The wrapping process took several days and was accompanied by constant ritual activity. Priests recited spells, burned incense, and performed ceremonies designed to restore the deceased's faculties and prepare them for the afterlife. Each layer of wrapping was considered a magical protection, and the final result was a mummy that was both preserved body and sacred object. The face was covered with a mask that would allow the deceased to be recognized in the afterlife. For pharaohs, this mask was made of gold, the flesh of the gods. For wealthy individuals, it might be made of cartonized layers of linen and plaster painted to resemble the deceased. Poor people might have simple painted faces or no masks at all. The completed mummy was placed in a coffin, which was itself a magical object designed to protect and transform the deceased. The coffin was decorated with images of gods and goddesses, inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, and shaped to resemble the god Osiris, ruler of the underworld. Wealthy individuals might have multiple nested coffins, each more elaborate than the last. The funeral procession was a public event that demonstrated the deceased's status and the family's devotion. The mummy was carried on a sledge pulled by oxen, accompanied by professional mourners, priests, and family members. The procession moved from the house of purification to the tomb, stopping at temples along the way for additional rituals. At the tomb entrance, the most important ritual of all took place, the opening of the mouth ceremony. Using special tools, a priest would symbolically open the mummy's mouth, eyes, and ears, restoring the deceased's ability to see, hear, speak, and eat in the afterlife. This ritual was essential for the deceased's resurrection and eternal life. The tomb itself was designed as an eternal home, furnished with everything the deceased would need in the afterlife. Food and drink were provided for sustenance, clothing for comfort, tools and weapons for protection, and servants in the form of shabdi figures, small mummiform statues, that would perform labor for the deceased in the afterlife. The walls of the tomb were decorated with scenes of daily life, religious texts, and images of the deceased enjoying eternal pleasures. These were not just decorations, but magical images that would become reality in the afterlife. The painted food would nourish the deceased. The depicted servants would serve them, and the illustrated activities would provide eternal entertainment. The afterlife itself was conceived as a perfected version of earthly existence. The deceased would live in the field of reeds, a paradise where the harvest was always abundant, the weather was always perfect, and the Nile always flooded at the proper time. They would serve Osiris, the god of the underworld, but they would also continue to enjoy the pleasures of life. But reaching this paradise was not automatic. The deceased had to navigate the dangers of the underworld, pass through various gates guarded by demons, and ultimately face the judgment of Osiris. In the Hall of Two Truths, the heart of the deceased would be weighed against the feather of Mat. If the heart was lighter than the feather, if the person had lived according to Mat, they would be granted eternal life. If not, they would be devoured by Ammit, the crocodile-headed monster, and cease to exist. The Book of the Dead provided guidance for this journey, containing spells and instructions that would help the deceased to overcome obstacles and achieve eternal life. These texts were placed in the tomb, written on papyrus scrolls or painted on coffins and tomb walls. The most important spells included the negative confession, in which the deceased declared their innocence of various sins. "I have not killed," the deceased would declare. "I have not stolen. I have not told lies. I have not been angry without cause. I have not polluted the water. I have not been proud." This moral accounting was central to Egyptian concepts of justice and eternal life. The family's obligations did not end with burial. They were expected to maintain the tomb, provide regular offerings of food and drink, and remember the deceased in their prayers. This ongoing relationship between the living and the dead was central to Egyptian religion and society. Professional priests might be hired to maintain the tomb and perform daily rituals, but family members were expected to visit regularly, especially during festivals when the dead were believed to return to their tombs to enjoy the offerings and the company of their descendants. The mummification of Amenhotep was completed after 70 days, the same period that the star Sirius disappeared from the sky before rising again to herald the new year and the Nile flood. This cosmic timing was not coincidental. It connected the deceased's resurrection to the eternal cycles of nature and the gods. As Eufa placed the final wrappings and sealed the last amulets, he knew that he had performed one of humanity's most sacred acts. He had transformed the mortal body into an eternal vessel, prepared a human soul for divine existence, and helped maintain the cosmic order that kept the universe functioning properly. The tomb of Amenhotep would remain sealed for thousands of years, its occupant resting in the hope of resurrection and eternal life. The mummy, the burial goods, and the decorated walls would preserve not just a body, but an entire worldview, the Egyptian understanding that death was not defeat, but victory, not ending but beginning, not separation but reunion with the gods who had created and sustained all life. In the end, the Egyptian approach to death was perhaps their greatest achievement, a triumph over mortality that allowed them to face the inevitable with hope, rather than fear, to see death not as the enemy of life, but as its ultimate fulfillment. The mummies that still rest in museums around the world are not just preserved corpses, but testimonies to the human refusal to accept death as final, to the eternal hope that love, memory, and devotion can overcome even the grave. As the sun sets over the Nile for the 10,000th time since our story began, the great river continues its eternal journey northward to the sea, carrying with it the dreams and memories of the civilization that flourished along its banks for 3,000 years. The mud brick houses of Memphis have crumbled to dust, the royal palaces have fallen to ruin, and the voices of pharaohs have been silenced forever. But the river flows on, and with it flows the legacy of ancient Egypt. Amenhotep the scribe, Kamwaset the farmer, Nefertiti, the baker's wife, Seneb the sculptor, We the merchant, Ufa the embalmer, all the people whose lives we have shared have long since made their own journeys to the afterlife. Their mummies rest in tombs carved into the limestone cliffs. Their names are recorded in temple archives. Their stories are preserved in the hieroglyphic texts that still speak to us across the centuries. What they created was more than a kingdom. It was a way of understanding the world, a vision of human existence that balanced the mortal and the divine, the practical and the spiritual, the individual and the eternal. They showed that civilization was not just about building cities and conquering enemies, but about creating meaning, beauty, and hope in the face of an uncertain world. The Egyptian achievement was not just in their monuments, magnificent as they are, but in their daily lives, in the way they raised their children, honored their gods, cared for their families, and faced death with courage and hope. They created a society that valued wisdom over wealth, justice over power, and eternal life over temporary success. Their influence spread far beyond the borders of Egypt itself. Greek philosophers studied in Egyptian temples, Roman emperors adopted Egyptian religious practices, and Jewish and Christian traditions incorporated Egyptian wisdom about the afterlife. The very alphabet we use today traces its ancestry back to Egyptian hieroglyphs, while our calendar is based on the Egyptian solar year. Modern medicine still marvels at Egyptian surgical techniques. Modern engineering studies their construction methods, and modern art continues to be inspired by their aesthetic principles. The Egyptian understanding of the human body, developed through mummification, laid the foundation for anatomical knowledge that would not be surpassed for thousands of years. But perhaps their greatest gift to humanity was their vision of death, not as an ending, but as a transformation. Their belief that love and memory could triumph over mortality. Their faith that the human spirit was eternal and indestructible. In a world often dominated by fear and despair, the Egyptians offered hope, the hope that life had meaning, that death was not final, and that the bonds of family and community could endure forever. The tourists who visit Egypt today, marveling at the pyramids and temples, are participating in a tradition that stretches back to ancient times. The Greeks and Romans came as pilgrims to see the wonders of Egyptian civilization, just as we do today. They understood, as we are beginning to understand, that Egypt represented something unique in human history, a civilization that achieved the perfect balance between this world and the next. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover Egyptian monuments are not just decorations, but voices from the past, speaking directly to us across the millennia. They tell us about people who lived and loved, worked and worried, hoped and feared, just as we do. They remind us that human nature is constant, that the fundamental challenges of existence, how to live a meaningful life, how to raise children, how to face death, are the same today as they were 4,000 years ago. The Egyptian answer to these challenges was to live according to Ma'at, to speak truth, act justly, care for others, and maintain harmony between the human and divine worlds. It was a philosophy that created one of history's most stable and enduring civilizations, one that survived conquest by Persians, Greeks, and Romans while maintaining its essential character. Today, as we face our own challenges, environmental crisis, social inequality, political instability, we might learn from the Egyptian example. They showed that a civilization could be both powerful and peaceful, both prosperous and just, both innovative and traditional. They proved that human beings could create societies that lasted not just for decades or centuries, but for millennia. The Nile still floods, though now it is controlled by modern dams. The sun still rises over the eastern desert and sets over the western cliffs. The stars still wheel overhead in the same patterns that Egyptian astronomers mapped thousands of years ago. In this eternal landscape, the achievements of ancient Egypt seem not ancient at all, but timeless as relevant today as they were when the first pharaoh united the two lands and began the great experiment in civilization that we call ancient Egypt. The scribes who recorded the daily life of ancient Egypt could never have imagined that their words would be read by people living in a world of computers and spacecraft, democracy, and human rights. But they wrote for eternity, and eternity has vindicated their faith. Their voices still speak to us, their wisdom still guides us, their hope still inspires us. In the end, the true monuments of ancient Egypt are not the pyramids or temples, magnificent as they are, but the ideas and ideals that they represent, the belief in human dignity, the pursuit of justice, the love of beauty, and the faith that life has meaning beyond the grave. These are the gifts that ancient Egypt has given to the world, and they are gifts that will endure as long as human beings seek to understand their place in the cosmos. The farmers who still work the fields along the Nile use tools and techniques that would be familiar to their ancient predecessors. The fishermen who cast their nets in the river's waters follow patterns established thousands of years ago. The craftsmen who create souvenirs for tourists employ skills passed down through countless generations. In these continuities, ancient Egypt lives on. But the deeper legacy lies in the realm of ideas and aspirations. The Egyptian vision of a just society, where the powerful were held accountable to divine law and the weak were protected by cosmic order, continues to inspire political reformers and social activists. Their understanding of death as transformation rather than termination offers comfort to the bereaved and hope to the dying. The Egyptian emphasis on education and literacy as paths to advancement helped establish the principle that knowledge should be accessible to all who seek it. Their integration of art and religion, beauty and meaning, showed that human creativity could serve both practical and spiritual purposes. Their respect for women's rights and family values demonstrated that a strong society must be built on strong relationships. Modern archaeology continues to reveal new aspects of Egyptian civilization, each discovery adding to our understanding of how these remarkable people lived, worked, and thought. The recent discovery of intact tombs, the decipherment of new texts, and the application of advanced scientific techniques to ancient materials all contribute to a growing appreciation of Egyptian achievements. But perhaps the most important discovery is not in the ground, but in ourselves, the recognition that we share fundamental human experiences with people who lived thousands of years ago. The Egyptian father teaching his son to write, the mother caring for her sick child, the craftsman taking pride in his work, the priest offering prayers for his community. These are not alien figures from a distant past, but fellow human beings whose hopes and fears, joys and sorrows mirror our own. The Egyptian understanding of time was cyclical rather than linear. They saw history not as a progression from primitive to advanced, but as an eternal repetition of fundamental patterns. The sun rose and set, the Nile flooded and receded. People were born and died, but the essential order of existence remained constant. This perspective offers a valuable corrective to our modern obsession with progress and change. In their art, the Egyptians achieved a perfect balance between realism and idealism, creating images that were both recognizably human and divinely beautiful. Their hieroglyphic writing combined the practical and the sacred, serving both administrative needs and religious purposes. Their architecture merged the monumental and the intimate, creating spaces that inspired awe while remaining fundamentally human in scale and purpose. The Egyptian synthesis of opposites, life and death, human and divine, temporal and eternal, offers a model for resolving the contradictions that plague modern life. They showed that it was possible to be both practical and spiritual, both individual and communal, both innovative and traditional. Their civilization was built on the principle that apparent opposites could be reconciled through wisdom, justice, and divine guidance. The environmental challenges facing modern Egypt, population growth, water scarcity, soil degradation, are not unlike those faced by the ancient Egyptians. Their solutions: careful water management, sustainable agriculture, population control through social organization, offer insights that remain relevant today. They understood that human civilization must work with natural cycles rather than against them. The social challenges of inequality, corruption, and political instability that affect modern societies were also known to the ancient Egyptians. Their response's emphasis on education, strong legal institutions, religious values that promoted social responsibility, provide models that contemporary societies might adapt to their own circumstances. The Egyptian approach to death and dying offers particular comfort in our age of medical technology and extended lifespans. Their understanding that death was a natural transition rather than a medical failure, their emphasis on preparing for death throughout life, and their belief in the continuation of relationships beyond the grave provide alternatives to the denial and fear that often characterize modern attitudes toward mortality. The elaborate funeral preparations of the ancient Egyptians might seem excessive to modern sensibilities, but they reflected a profound understanding of the importance of memory, continuity, and hope in human life. The mummies that rest in museums around the world are not just preserved bodies, but testimonies to the human refusal to accept death as final. The Egyptian emphasis on family and community offers important lessons for societies struggling with individualism and social fragmentation. Their understanding that personal identity was inseparable from social relationships, that individual success was meaningless without community welfare, and that the living had obligations to both ancestors and descendants, provides a model for rebuilding social cohesion. The role of religion in Egyptian society, not as a separate sphere of life, but as the foundation that gave meaning to all activities, suggests ways that modern societies might integrate spiritual values with practical concerns. The Egyptian gods were not distant abstractions, but intimate companions who participated in daily life, offering guidance, comfort, and hope. As we face an uncertain future, the Egyptian example reminds us that civilizations can endure, that human creativity can triumph over adversity, and that the search for meaning and beauty is not a luxury but a necessity. They showed that it was possible to build societies that honored both human dignity and divine purpose, that served both present needs and eternal aspirations. The Nile continues to flow northward to the sea, carrying the silt that renews the land and the memories that connect past to present. Along its banks, the monuments of ancient Egypt stand as eternal reminders of what human beings can achieve when they combine practical wisdom with spiritual vision, when they build for eternity rather than just for today. In the end, the greatest lesson of ancient Egypt is not about the past, but about the future, the understanding that human civilization is not inevitable but must be constantly renewed, that the values we cherish must be actively maintained, and that each generation has the responsibility to pass on to the next, not just material wealth, but spiritual wisdom. The scribes of ancient Egypt wrote for eternity, and their words have achieved immortality. The craftsmen created for the gods, and their works still inspire wonder. The farmers fed their communities, and their techniques still nourish the land. The priests maintained the cosmic order, and their understanding of the sacred still offers guidance to the seeking soul. As our journey through ancient Egypt comes to an end, we carry with us not just knowledge of the past, but wisdom for the future. We have learned that human beings are capable of creating civilizations of extraordinary beauty and endurance, that the search for meaning is universal and eternal, and that death itself cannot destroy the bonds of love, memory, and hope that connect us across time and space. The sun sets over the Nile, as it has for millions of years and will for millions more. In that eternal rhythm, we find both humility and hope. Humility in the face of time's vastness, hope in the knowledge that human creativity and love can create monuments more enduring than stone, more precious than gold, more lasting than the pyramids themselves. The river flows on, carrying the dreams of the past toward the promise of the future, reminding us that we too are part of the eternal story, that our lives too have meaning, and that we too can contribute to the great work of human civilization that began on the banks of the Nile so many thousands of years ago. In the shadow of the gods, the ancient Egyptians lived lives of purpose and meaning. In the light of their example, we too can find our way toward a future worthy of the past they have bequeathed to us. A future where wisdom guides power, where beauty serves truth, where love conquers death, and where the human spirit, like the Nile itself, flows eternal and free.